Hello everybody, I'm Grace, and today I'm going to go to a new book. Who was Steve Jobs? You probably know him as very familiar because, he invents Apple. So, who was Steve Jobs? Steve Jobs always loved machines. His father repaired machines for a living. As a child, Steve loved to watch his dad build and fix things. When Steve grew up, he started a company that built machines. Not just any machines, but a machine Steve was sure would soon become part of daily life, just like cars and TV sets. What was this machine? A personal computer. Today, millions of people own personal computers. But back in the 1970s, nobody did. The first modern computer came out in 1938. A computer built in 1946 was as big as a room. When Steve was a kid, computers was too big and complicated for the average person to use. The government used them to gather information. Steve was going to change that. Steve and his friend Steve Wozniak started Apple Computers in the Ghostbusters garage. Their computer, the Apple II, was a hit of a West Coast computer fair in 1977. Why? Because it looked fun to use. In 1979, Steve visited the research center of the tech company Xerox. It was in Palo Alto, California. He walked around, looking at the new computers the engineers were working on. "What's that?" Steve asked one man. He pointed to a small gadget by a computer. When the engineer moved the gadget with his hand, an arrow on the computer screen moved too. "This is a point-and-click graphical user interface," the man explained. That sure was a complicated name for a gadget that did something very simple and very amazing. Every time the man moved the pointer to a picture on the screen and clicked, he opened a program on the computer. Steve stared at the little gadget. In 1979, computers were operated by punching in keys on the keyboard. To work on a computer, you had to know the right keys to push. This little gadget made using the computer so much easier. Steve couldn't believe it. He imagined having something similar for his computers. "When are you going to sell it?" he asked the engineer. "We're not," he said. "It's fun, but there's no market for it." Steve Jobs knew differently. He stared at the little gadget. He could see the future rolling out in front of him. Billions of people pointing and clicking on their home computers. He would have to improve the gadget. He would make it better. He wouldn't call it a point-and-click graphical user interface. He would call it by its friendlier nickname, the mouse. This one. That day, Steve knew the world was going to change. And he, Steve Jobs, was going to make it happen. Chapter 1. Growing up in the Lap Valley. In 1994, Joan Skibble was a graduate student in University of Wisconsin. She fell in love with a teaching assistant. He was from Syria, and his name was Abdul Fattah Jandali. Very complicated. They were young and had no money, so Joanne learned she was going to have a baby. They decided to put the baby up for adoption. Paul and Clara Jobs wanted a child very much. They adopted the couple's baby and named him Stephen Paul Jobs. He was born on February 24th, 1955. 3 years after Steve was born, the Jobs adopted a little girl, Patty. Steve liked his little sister, but they didn't have much in common. The family lived in Mountain View, California. It was a beautiful area full of fruit trees. People called it Valley of Heart's Delight. But Mountain View was changing. New companies were coming to the area. The companies were trying to develop new electronic equipment. Eventually, the area became known by a different name, Silicon Valley. Steve loved to help his father work on cars. Paul even made him his own little workbench when he was 5. He showed him how to use a hammer and a saw. Paul was a mechanical whiz, and he passed on his love of gadgets to his son. A neighbor gave Steve his first health kit. Steve made radio transistors with it. In 1968, when he was 13, Steve discovered a part missing from one of his kits. The kit was made by Hewlett-Packard, a big company in Silicon Valley that developed and made parts for computers. Steve got a phone book and looked up the number of Bill Hewlett. He was one of the founders of the company. Steve called him to complain. By the time they got off the phone, Hewlett had offered Steve a summer job and promised him a bag full of machine parts. What was Steve's answer? Yes, of course. Steve also joined Hewlett-Packard's Explorer Club. It offered lectures to kids interested in electronics at one lecture. Steve saw a computer for the first time. At school, Steve hung around with other kids who loved electronics. He also had a girlfriend, Kristen Brennan. Through the kids in his computer club, Steve met Steve Wozniak, who was several years older. Woz has amazing talent for making things. He was going to a local college and designing computers as a hobby. When Steve graduated from high school in 1972, he enrolled at Reed College in Oregon. There was only one problem. Steve couldn't pay for college. So Steve went to the dean of Reed. He asked he could live in the dorms and sit in on classes for free. Steve wouldn't ever get a degree, but he would learn about subjects he was interested in. Why would the dean agree to that? Like Bill Hewlett at Hewlett-Packard, the dean was impressed by Steve, and he did say yes. Within a week, Steve was attending classes. He studied Eastern religions and calligraphy, which was the art of fine handwriting. It wasn't an easy life. Steve slept on the floor of his friend's room. He collected Coke bottles for spending money, and he depended on local charities for food. Steve stayed at the Reed for 18 months. He'd had enough of college life. He wanted to go to India. To get money for the trip, he took a job at Atari. It made some of the very first computer games. His friend was already working there. By summer, Steve had saved enough to go to India. After the trip, he came back to Atari personal computers in 1976. If you saw them at all, it looked like airplane cockpits full of switches and lights. Woz had created a circuit board for an easy-to-use personal computer. A person would type in a command, Woz explained to Steve. The computer would follow the command on the TV screen in front of the person. Walls thought of it as a neat project. Steve thought it would be more than that. He thought they should leave Atari and start a whole new company. So that's all of chapter 1, and I will see you in chapter 2 and also 3. Bye!